Make sure that's good. All right. So, as mentioned, my name is Scott Friend. I'm the acting deputy at ALTESS right now, and Chad Vance, one of our division chiefs. So we're going to kind of walk you through application modernization primarily this morning. We'll talk a little bit about some of the other services we offer that kind of enable application modernization, as well as a little bit about risk management framework and some of those pieces. So we'll try to tie it in with some of what AMBO does and what's going on as well. So I'm going to kind of talk through, give you a brief intro of ALTESS and some of the overview processes, and then Chad's going to take you through the application modernization piece, and then I'll pop back up to talk through a few other things. So our primary focus at ALTESS is really to be an IT service provider, right? So we're going to focus on the first two today primarily, the application modernization and migration piece, as well as the cyber defense and RMF cybersecurity piece as well. So the first is really where we integrate with AMBO. You saw AMBO's 6-step process yesterday, so walk you through, and around step 2 or 3 is kind of where we insert in to do the modernization and migration piece as well, and then fall back into that process. Cybersecurity, these days, obviously, cybersecurity is a big deal, making sure everything stays secure. One of the big impetuses behind application modernization is to make sure that our applications are secure. So the cybersecurity, cyber defense, RMF services that we offer are a key to that. The IT services platform, just to touch on that real quick, is the underlying infrastructure that allows us to in-house do the modernization of applications. It's the shared network infrastructure, the shared storage infrastructure, the shared virtualization storage server infrastructure that really allows us to provide those services. And then the last piece being those standardized processes. Those are really what wraps around all of the services that we offer that allow us to deliver things in a standardized, uniform way, in a consistent way, and provide those consistent results. So I think you're probably all here primarily for the modernization piece, so I'm going to let Chad go in on that, and I'll be back up in a few minutes.
So as Scott said, my name is Chad Vance, and I run the Application Services Division at ALTESS. So before we get into a definition of modernization, so I've been at ALTESS almost 9 years, and we've been doing a migration modernization effort for those 9 years. We just really haven't called it that, but we have a lot of customers who come in and the application needs a tech refresh. They're looking at new architecture. And so and I'm going to go back a slide. So some of these processes that we've put in place have been over a decade or more of work doing this type of work across the Army and the DoD. And part of what makes ALTESS unique in that fashion is that the end-to-end support that we can provide to an organization, to an Army system, starts and ends with requirements to delivery all the way through the full spectrum with regard to compute services, IT managed services, application support, information assurance. So when we started looking at how to define modernization, we started pulling from some of the experience we had and wanted to try to tie that into how can we help support the AMBO migration process, and then how can we fill gaps between when you go through the process till you go to a hosting location. What are some services we can provide to do that? So, modernization. Is this the definition of modernization? No. And if anybody wants to submit, we're running a contest to see the best definition for modernization, because I don't think it's very clearly defined in the Army today. I walked around the conference this week, and I heard every definition from, well, if you virtualize it, it's modern. Well, I can tell you I've taken 20-year-old applications and put them on a virtual architecture. They are by no means modern. I've heard the other end of the spectrum, that you have to rip the guts out of it, put it on a new platform, optimize the database, virtualize the architecture, run it through a whole gamut, which I will tell you, because we've done that too, that's a very long, costly process for application owners. So somewhere in the middle, you really get into what is a definition that the Army wants to see for modernization. So when we started looking at it, we started to define, well, so the Army likes to measure everything, right? We've got to measure how successful you are at modernizing. We've got to measure how successful you are at migrating. Some of this stuff is not measurable when you get into infinite level modernization, what we're going to call strategic, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So when we start to scope that down, how can we define modernization into something that we can measure, so we can help facilitate the migration process? So there's a couple of areas, and I want to talk about that more in the next slide. But so when we look at modernization, we break it down into multiple components. The first two components you've heard about, and I'll go ahead and show you that. So the first two components are foundational. This is really what AMBO's doing right now. Collecting information, looking at the as-is, looking at rate cards to figure out what your cost would be for compute. And then there's a lot of discussion about, well, what else is there? So what else goes behind the total cost of ownership? When do you know you need to have an application modernized? That's a great question. I can't tell you what triggers a modernization effort. I can tell you that we are focusing more on compliance to standardization. So those are things I can measure. Compliance is defined. Regulations tell me what I have to do to make an application secure. There's certain standardization qualities that we want to make sure that our applications adhere to, so we lower sustainment costs, or we improve performance, or we increase efficiencies. So this transitional, to me, is something that we can start to measure and provide services to do that. So let me give you an example. So how many of you have heard of, it's a tool called Fortify, but you could use anything. It does vulnerability scanning. So we vulnerability scan every application that comes through ALTESS. It's not required, by the way. There's no IA reg that says you have to fortify anything. There are regs about STIGs. There's regs about certain controls you have to pass to meet an RMF qualification. But there's nothing that says you have to vulnerability scan an application. So why do we do it? Well, because a lot of those applications are hosted in their facility. If they're hosted in their facility, we want to make sure we're eliminating any vulnerabilities to our infrastructure. So I ran an application through Fortify. It was an Army customer a while back. By the way, they wanted to be modernized, which means they wanted on virtual equipment. I did that. So by their definition, they were modern. I ran it through Fortify, and there were 4,000 vulnerability findings. 4,000. Now, you get some false positives, you get some erroneous data, but that's why you analyze the findings, right? So you analyze those findings to make sure you can provide them with the findings that have merit. So they said, hey, we want you all to remediate those findings. It took us 4 months to remediate 4,000 findings. So we didn't touch anything other than existing code and putting it on a virtual network, and we got to a transitional phase. So we made them compliant. By the way, they didn't have CAC authentication. We embedded that into it. And then we put them on a virtual infrastructure, and we checked the box that said you're modernized. It was about 2 months later they said, our application really sucks. We need it to align more to our business model. We've got too many inefficiencies with how we do inventory management. We've got inefficiencies in how information is configuration management of the data. So we went through a strategic plan for them. Again, by every definition of transitional, they're modern, but by what I consider a true definition of modernization, when you start to get into aligning the technology to your business needs, optimizing the database, refactoring code to remove vulnerabilities and gain efficiencies, they weren't there. So we sat down for a week and we defined every requirement for this application. We've been strategically modernizing that app for quite a while now. However, the end goal has been we've reduced the amount of errors in the information. We've increased their efficiency in their inventory management. To be honest, I think you could probably replace 5 to 8 FTEs with the way we've put some automation into the application that they didn't have. And so we went through that strategic modernization. So let me go back. So then how do we facilitate a migration, right? And this is something we're working very closely with AMBO. So we know that the onus is on the system owner to get their application to a migration-ready state. What's the definition of that, right? We can have a contest for that as well. Migration-ready state could be we're going to shovel a cow pie from one pasture to another, so we're going to leave it as is and move crap from here to there. Or does it need to meet a standard? And what is the standard? It's not defined. Does everybody need to be on .NET? Does everybody need to be Java? There's no definition, right? There are some industry standards we need to look at. There are some IA controls we need to look at. Again, Fortify is not a requirement. My argument is everything should go through a vulnerability scan. So if we're going to move something, what are we really gaining from a systems perspective outside of saying we moved it? So I think one of the biggest arguments we have, one of your biggest cost savings, now there's a huge benefit to consolidating data centers. But if your application still costs $1 million to sustain every year, it still costs you $1 million to sustain. So the benefit is how do we modernize that app to lower sustainment costs, to leverage economies of scale at the facilities they're going to be hosted at, and to do not only the application or the code-based modernization, but the architecture. So what we want to try to do is we want to try to meet some of those gaps. So how do we fill a gap? Well, as Johanna mentioned yesterday, they're identifying what you're going to be required to do, and then the onus goes on the application owner to perform those modernizations, to schedule the migrations. So we want to help facilitate that. So the list of services you saw before break down into a number of other more detailed services. But the modernization piece, the application piece for me is we want to be able to provide these system owners an avenue to say, listen, I went through the migration process. I really want to know where my application is at as I'm moving it. I might need help getting it to the end location in a migration-ready or cloud-ready state. So can ALTESS help me do that? And the answer is yes. We're doing it now. Every application in my division has went through this process. They're on virtual machines. They're on more current code bases. We've optimized the database. We've scanned everything. We do quarterly STIG compliance so that we meet the IA requirements for hosting there. And if they wanted to move tomorrow, it's not a big leap. They're in an environment that, with minimal effort, could be moved to any data center in the U.S. and put on a virtual machine and stood up in short term. Now, the application in my division are not big ERPs. That's a different animal. They're more manageable business systems. Some of them do have a lot of users. Some of them don't. This is where we would like to get. Now, this is really the system owners who want to make an investment into saying, so I need to improve to gain some of those efficiencies. Right now, I've got a guy in a warehouse walking around with an Excel spreadsheet looking at a barcode on a piece of equipment and checking it off. Or I've got a gentleman who's inputting documentation. There's no configuration management, so I've got 100 versions of the same document. Whatever the business model is, if they see benefits in the data integrity or the efficiency of how the business processes need to run, then they want to make this investment. Calculating the return on investment is difficult, as you all probably know if you have any systems that you're managing. But we've seen some big return on investment for some of the longer-term strategic modernization processes. My argument is these two areas is where the Army's going to focus. This is my opinion. I think they're going to focus because they can measure it. So I think they're not just going to want to throw the cow pie into the other field. I think they're going to want to know, how do I make that better as I throw it to the other field? So one of the things we see all the time, if you have an RO, somebody who assumes risk for that application, a lot of times they're blindly assuming risk. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't think I am. They're blindly assuming risk for an application because they don't know. So we need to inform them of what they're assuming risk for. How many vulnerabilities does your application have? Does all the software have cons? Is it approved? When was the last time it was stigged? Does it meet two-part authentication? The list goes on and on and on, that if you provided them a situational awareness report of their system, they would know what they're checking off when they want to go to another data center. And they may want to fix some things because they're assuming the responsibility for that application. So one of the reasons we do the vulnerability scanning, the STIG compliance, we do the con work, is so that when we send that up to our RO, she's got a full report of everything that was wrong, how it's been fixed, and where it stands now. So when they sign off on that application, it's got a clean slate. Yes, sir. Okay, so the question is, do we look at PIA? Yes. So when we do the requirements survey, data information is part of the survey that we go through to find out what type of information will be used, stored, transported, and then how we need to build that into the design of the redesign. Because we do have systems with that. And we've got a very good database team who set up a lot of the storage security components to manage that, and then we manage it in the application based on the regulation. We do both, at rest and in transit. And by the way, I want this to be a very open forum. So we've got 60 minutes that we get to enjoy each other's company. If you don't ask enough questions, you're going to have to hear a lot of really bad jokes at the end. So are there any questions with kind of the thought process of this? Again, we're going from experience and thinking that we can measure this. This is more of a customer I would like to have. I think there are return on investments here, and we'll tell you if there's not, if you go through a process. But we've got a lot of 20-year-old applications that think they're modern because they're virtualized. Yes. So we have, yes. So the question is do we have a staff on board that is funded to help with these services? So each of our divisions is set up in a specific functional area, from cyber to service level management, the business side, to operations where it's the guys racking the servers, engineering, application support. So if you came in tomorrow and said, hey, they want to put me in this data center, but I don't have any system administrators, so I'm going to have to pay a vendor or somebody to do my system administration. you can come to ALTESS. We sit down with you. We look at the requirements. We can help work with that hosting facility to define the system administration needs, and then give you a quote for how many ever hours it's going to take to do that and perform that function. Exactly. So I also manage a lot of code that's not hosted at ALTESS. And that's fine, because we have and I'm going to show you in a minute, we have a very detailed process for managing that code. So it goes through all the same checks I just mentioned for security, but it also goes through a very detailed configuration management process so that when it goes out the door, it can be deployed at a remote location. We don't have to, it's not our concern about what's at the hosting location. The only thing we care about is that it will operate there. So if we develop it in Java or .NET, everything's the same there, we can do it. We're looking at containerizing in the future. I think that's going to be a big push for the modernization effort going forward. So not as much as we would like to, but I do have some apps that operate on mobile platforms. It's something I'd like to get into. At my old job, we got into it, and we were very successful at it. So that's a skill set question. I would have to hire the right skill set to do it. That's not an uncommon problem. I had an application come to me that was such historic code that I had to go find somebody, which took a really long time, that even knew what the hell it was. But we did, and now that code is in a .NET format. So the question is, what's the velocity we can onboard, and does it lower costs for other customers? So the lowering the cost part, let me talk about that. So no, it doesn't lower the cost, because we're not, there's some organizations who are a model based on how many they have in the facility. That's the way their cost model works. That's not the way our cost model works. We're only provisioning equipment that the customer needs. We're only doing labor that's required to meet the project, so you pay for your actual cost. Now, what can happen, and this is, I've got some customers who share virtual farms, so they may share a 4-server farm. They pay for their percentage of that farm, and that can, but server costs are very low. I mean, that's not the delta when it comes to driving. It's labor, storage. So the answer to the question is, we've spent probably 5 years developing a very robust cost model. It's got hundreds of cost elements. It goes down to administration time, just how much we pay for a storage disk. And what it's geared toward is, because we're all looked at for how you spend the consumer's money, is it's geared to being able to accurately track what that application needs from a hardware, software, labor standpoint to perform that function, and that's what gets passed over to the customer. From how fast we can onboard. So we've got a pretty robust onboarding process. We have a requirements manager in our business office that sits down and does requirements gathering. We have an engineering team that sits down and goes through the engineering approach for the operating environment. The application team looks at the application and provides level of efforts to do any of these functions that need to be performed, at what level the customer wants to perform them. So within, a couple of weeks, we usually have a proposal out for approval, and then once the funding is submitted, we start putting project plans together and start work. It's really as they come in right now. I mean, we've been heavy in the last couple of months with onboarding customers, but it really depends on the volume at the time. But I couldn't tell you what our throughput is. I don't know that. Okay, so once we've determined what tier that we're going to go through, the approach is something that we've used for a long time. We take the information that we gather from the requirements. We go through 2 parallel assessments. One is the operating environment. because guess what? Half of the customers don't know what they really need for an operating environment, especially now that we're moving into more efficient hardware. And we also go through an application assessment. So Scott's going to talk a little bit about the engineering piece later, but that engineering assessment takes you from an as-is to a to-be recommendation. And then the application assessment, my opinion, should include things like vulnerability scanning, going through the code, quality assurance. And then we provide remediation findings. And those remediation findings can either be resolved by your team, your vendors, we can help resolve. But once they're remediated, reassessment occurs, everything checks out. We call that migration ready. So you've gotten everything up to this level, this transitional level, and you're ready to migrate. I know that sounds pie in the sky because I love hearing Army leaders say, waving the wand saying, we're going to modernize, migrate everything. So I don't want it to sound like it's just that easy. There's a lot of stuff that goes into that process. But the key in both of these is definition of terms. What are you trying? What's your end goal? And that's why we go through that detailed requirements gathering session. All right, this is my last slide, and I'll turn it back over to Scott, but I want to take some questions before I do. So I've been there 9 years. So we've been looking at Agile for the majority of the time I've been there. So we use an Agile approach to our application modernizations, tech refreshes, whatever you want to call them. As anybody knows, big requirement session. So I'm a civil engineer. One of the best classes I took said you should spend a third of your time designing the skyscraper before you even lay a brick. Same concept, right? Every time a requirement changes late in the process, you start to creep. So we try to gather as much of that up front as possible. We go through a very detailed requirements review with the customer. And then the next thing that we do is we do a security review of the application. So we go through and look at the vulnerabilities. We look at what platform you're on. Are your cons up to date? Are your products approved? Everything. Once we go through the security review, we start looking at design recommendations. So the design recommendations are, again, driven by the customer. Where do you want to go? How far do you want to go in the time we have? And we then put together a remediation plan or a modernization plan. That plan for us falls into 2-week sprints. They're all storied out. All the requirements are storied out into 2-week sprints. That allows us to run several sprints in parallel while we're getting previous sprints QA'd and user acceptance testing. One of the biggest complaints we had when I first started, we were the old waterfall development shop, was why am I waiting 6 months to a year to get a product? Because my requirements just changed. So what we did for the first 6 months, now we're spreading out to another 6 months. And I had one project that went from a 6-month deliverable to being delivered 18 months later because the customer goes, nope, I don't want that anymore. Now I want this. Oh, don't want that anymore. Now I want this. With these 2-week sprints, it allows those types of changes to be rolled into a subsequent sprint that we can then change on the fly without jeopardizing the whole delivery of the application. Yes. So we work very closely with the engineering team. So one of the first things that we try to do is to identify what the best operating environment to put a new application on or a refreshed application on. So when we go to them, we capture how many users, how many transactions, all the typical data you capture. We talk to the engineering team. We all agree that we're looking at this size of an environment, which then allows us to start to tailor the application code to that environment. Database is another big factor. Oracle, MySQL, I mean, we go through which database. Sometimes it's how much money do you have? You know, are you going to pay for the big, enormous database, or are you going to throw a MySQL database on it? So most of that is done with the communication with the engineering team. And then we start tracking on the application piece on top of that. Does that answer your question? Yes. Yes. And a lot of times we're driving the architecture based on the application code as well, right? What platform is it on sometimes drives that architecture. And drives some of the security. The RMF drives a lot for us. I mean, we spend as much time in compliance review some weeks as we do in development, because we're doing STIG compliance vulnerability scans, doing all the stuff that we need to do to stay at a ready state. So that can be challenging. The other thing that we've done is we've beefed up our testing team. When I got there, the testing team were the developers. That's a big conflict of interest, because the developers always think their stuff works. They're wrong most of the time. Now we've set up. So we use some software project management tools that also align with the testing tools. So when we set the sprints up, they're based on requirements. The requirements define tasks. The test cases reflect those tasks and feed back into the requirements, so you know when the requirements met after the QA phase. So that's been a huge benefit for us. And then the other piece is the configuration management. We go through a very robust configuration management process. So weekly meetings to discuss releases, where we're at, where we need to go, have all the boxes been checked. And then we have a configuration advisory board that meets for major releases to make sure they're approved across the organization. And all that is once the user has said you've met my requirement, then we go through and push it out. So that's my guess of what modernization is. I think there's a lot of room on either side of that to figure out what we need to do. But right now, we've got to be able to measure something. We can't just keep moving applications from one home to another and saying by putting them on a virtual platform is the answer. I think we need to make sure that we're making them more secure for the Army. We need to make sure that we're helping that consumer divest some of the cost of that application, so that they're not paying for 3 development FTEs every year just to make sure that the wheels keep moving. So I think there's some obligation to inform system owners, to provide assistance where we can, to say, hey, based on your requirement and your funding level and your mandates, we can provide some services. I don't want to make it such a push model that says you must do this, right? You're going to do what you need to do to keep your application running. I got it. I was an operational guy for 15 years. So all we really want to do is make you aware of the services we have, provide you enough education, enough information so you can make an educational decision on at what point do I want to stop a modernization effort, and what point should I be required to start a modernization effort. So again, the question we get all the time is, what's the trigger? I don't know. I have no idea. I can tell you what I think it is. We need to be compliant. We need to be standard. Those definitions are not there to the extent they should be, but we're working toward that. So before I turn it back over to Scott, any questions on the modernization piece? Any advice for me? Because if you think I'm saying it wrong, hey, I'm open for suggestions. Right. So I think you've hit it on the head, right? So the same teams could do the same administration regardless of where that is, right? So my comment is, are we doing it to the same standard? Now, I'm not so sure that's happening because I've received a lot of applications that were approved that don't pass the sniff test in Air Center. So I think you're right. What I don't want to come across, because we're a government organization, right? We're here to make sure we use the taxpayers' money the best of our ability, support these application systems. We're not for the bottom line. So I'm not trying to sell our way as the best way. What I'm trying to say is if you don't have that, there are options in the government to get that. If you need assistance in areas where your teams can't do that, but I think that what you're saying is you will start to see that ASP model develop down the road. It's going to have to at some point, right? I think you have to get to a point where you're providing some common services to a common standard to get to that end goal. Does that make sense? You want to talk to that?
Yeah, I agree. And so from the infrastructure services, that's exactly how we operate, right? We have a lot of, we use shared resources across the board in that arena. And the reason we're able to do that is because we have a lot of standardization. Unfortunately, right now, as we've talked through for the past 30 minutes, we all know that applications are far from standard across the Army. And that's where it becomes a lot harder to have those shared resources. You know, I got to have a guy that knows 40 different programming languages because, you know, I mean, we've had folks come in that have COBOL as their,
yes,
you know, application code base. Well, I mean, we probably don't have many people sitting around that happen to know that, right? So that's where it becomes a big challenge just from the application services side to have that shared capability while there is such a diversity of applications out in the Army. So as we get more standardization in that area, I absolutely agree, because as we all know, I mean, labor is one of the largest cost drivers that we have. So the more and more we can standardize, the more we can share those resources, the better. And that's really how we drive down costs from the infrastructure side of things, from the server support, from the, you know, the Windows guys, the Unix guys, the storage guys, everybody that we can use to share. Yeah, absolutely, we save a lot of money for folks.
And that discussion is very, very challenging sometimes, because when you start to talk about an application owner switching to a more standard platform, it's a huge cost. I mean, that first year is a big, it's a sunk cost that you're still running on old, developing new. That's not very palatable sometimes. Sometimes they're bought into the technology they're into, right? They're already sold on it, and they're not moving. I want that. I want to hug it. I want to touch it. I don't want it to move. I've got a customer now that's being sold moving to a language that I don't think is very sustainable language, but that's what they're being sold, right? So until somebody identifies that standard like we're starting to do with architecture, it's a very big challenge. Yes, sir. So not my call. So when they do application rationalization, that is a level at the function. That's at the functional level, and Dennis maybe will talk to this more. But that is not my call. We're assuming if we get an application that comes to us, it's been rationalized and it's been approved for modernization. Yes. And we've done that for a customer who said, I've got a suite of applications, kind of give me a ballpark on what it's going to take so I know what to kill and what not to. So we've done that. Anything else? I'll turn it over to Scott to wrap it up.
So Chad gave you obviously a really good overview of the application modernization migration services that we offer. So I kind of talked through a few other areas that really kind of enable us and allow us to provide those services, kind of the back end, the behind the scenes part of ALTESS that really allows us to offer those services. So the service level management process that we have and the service level management team that we have are really the enablers. They're the ones that really bring these services to our customers. So they're the front end, they're the face, they're the folks that the customers are talking to. They're the folks that are doing the requirements gathering. They're doing the project management. They're the ones that are really, they're the support. They're the voice of the customer within ALTESS. So they're the interface that allows the customer to come in and gain access to those services. And the key behind all of the service level management processes that we have is we do them for systems that are hosted at ALTESS, but there's no requirement for that. We can provide those services no matter where a customer is hosted, and we really are trying to, as Chad mentioned, make these things cloud ready, make systems cloud ready, make applications cloud ready. And even once a customer moves to the cloud, a system moves to the cloud, there's still a lot that is not provided. They're going to give you servers, they're going to give you storage, yes. That's about all you're going to get. So all of those interfacing services that those service level managers provide to system administration services, those shared services like you mentioned, do you want every application owner out there going to hire their own system administrators to support the 2 servers that they have out in the cloud? To me, that doesn't sound all that efficient. You're going to go from something that we could support with some guy working on it an hour a week to paying a guy 40 hours every week to sit there and do an hour of work. So the service level management processes that we have will allow us to bring those services to customers regardless, again, of where a system lives. And the other real key process that we have that Chad kind of alluded to is the system engineering process and the system engineering services that we leverage. So this is really where, when a customer comes in, we do all of that requirements gathering. They reach out to us. We have our engineers get on the phone along with the requirements manager and the service level managers so that we can really understand technically what it is they're trying to do. And that's really what we're trying to find out. We don't necessarily want to know what you have right now. I mean, we need to know what you have right now, but we really are trying to find out what is it you're trying to do. So we try to ask questions to lead those customers down that road. Give us the problem you're trying to solve. Don't just tell me, I've got 8 servers, I need 8 servers. Well, okay, you do have 8 servers, but you're not using those 4, and those 4 are 10% utilized. So what is it you really need? And that's another way that we can help drive down those costs, right? We really, through this process, try to right-size applications. So, you notice that we have a lot of reviews that go through. This is a constant interaction with both the customer as well as internal ALTESS systems, ALTESS teams, to make sure that we're designing something that will function and also meets the application owner's requirements. This, again, we really try to focus, like Chad said, to a good chunk of our time on this side. We try to focus on the left side of this as much as possible. Because again, just like with application development, if we decide, all right, you need 4 servers, you need an Oracle database, you need this, that, or the other, and then we get over here and start building it, and they go, nah, wait, that's not going to work. This is a Windows app. We have to have MySQL. This is this. We have to have this. So we really try to focus our time over here. Usually, again, Chad mentioned it's usually a few-week process we go through to at least get a pretty good understanding. And then once everybody says, good, yeah, I think that's going to work, we'll go through a little more detail before we really start that implementation. Because again, we really want to make sure once this starts, we're not going back. So out of this, we get a good technical data package that defines all of the aspects of a system. We really, again, focused around ITIL. All of our processes, the SOM process, also all focused around ITIL. And once we come out of this and start building, and any updates get made to that technical data package, we should be left with a pretty good set of documentation that will then allow us to go into that cybersecurity and the RMF process. So we really offer, again, a full suite of cybersecurity services from the basics. Hey, we need to do patch management. Hey, we need to scan your systems with, we have to have HPSS. We have to have those things. So those basic scanning services, make sure you're patching your system, things like that. We do all of those, but then we go to the next level with all of the RMF services that we provide. So we do things like help you analyze your system to see what level you're at. Are you a high, high, high? Are you a low, high, low? Whatever one of those 27 different choices you get when you determine what controls then of those 400 and some odd RMF controls that you need to do. So we go through, walk people through that process. We provide training to our customers oftentimes on how to go through the RMF process. We directly support the SCA teams when they come on site to make sure that they have all of the information they need. And it really is more of a engineering service for RMF that our cybersecurity folks provide. Sorry, go ahead. Excuse me, sorry, I didn't catch it. The question was, what tools do we use to support that? So we obviously use the mandated tools that we have out there, whether it's through the HPSS tools, whether it's the scanning tools that the Army provides us. We use all of those. And primarily that is really what we use. EMAS, obviously, yes. So, and again, so primarily EMAS. So all the controls are documented in EMAS, right? And so a system that lives at ALTESS for whatever period of time inherits some number of controls. I say some number because it depends on how much we support, where you sit in our stack, and all sorts of other things. But these guys will help determine that, and it's actually all very clearly documented in the service level agreements that we provide and all that. But those are all inherited through EMAS. We walk you through and explain exactly what is inherited, what you get. We will provide the documentation for all of those controls that you do inherit for any system that we support. So you don't have to then provide those. It's all done through EMAS, which does actually make one of the nice things about RMF, one of the few. Sure. So if I got the question, it's that for everything do we have to do a recertification and do an IA look, or? So that's a very good question, and I'll give the DAU answer if it depends, because it really does depend. It honestly depends a lot on what that AO is willing to accept. What is our AO willing to accept? What risk is she willing to accept, or he willing to accept, and what risk is that application owner's AO willing to accept? Oftentimes, we'll say, look, small, you're a sister organization, something like that, we might let you come in and sit under our accreditation for 6 months, 9 months, a year, whatever that is. But we'll write that into the service level agreement and say, all right, you're good for 6 months. After that, you got to go through this whole process. So it really depends. It depends on what is classified as a change large enough to trigger another look. And what is that look? Is that a full SCA visit? SCAB visit? Is that just somebody coming in and doing a cursory check and sending it up to the AO? It should be a lot more clearly defined, quite frankly, but it unfortunately really is not. Yep. So yes, a lot of what we provide from monitoring, the reporting up through ACAS, through the scanning systems, things like that, tracking through EMAS, and those reports, they're in support of the continuous monitoring, whether it's what we do for log management. All of those are in support of continuous monitoring, and that obviously is the goal of RMF, is to have that continuous monitoring so you don't have well, yes, exactly. That is obviously the goal, and that's really the tools that the Army-wide is putting in place are aimed at that. They're not there yet, quite frankly. Everybody wants to get away from the very expensive SCA team visit every 3 years when you also only pay attention to security every 2.5 years, and all of a sudden everybody runs around with their hair on fire and secures things real quick and everything looks great, and then 2 weeks later it looks like crap again. So obviously that's what we're trying to get away from. We do have, we do have a lot of tools in place that can support that continuous monitoring, whether it be tools to monitor for data exfiltration, tools like that. So we have a lot of those in place. There's not really a great way to feed that into some sort of central Army-wide tracking tool at this point in time, though. At least not that I'm aware of. If you guys know of one, that would be great. I think that is about my last slide. We have 5 more minutes for questions. If anybody wants their CUs. That's just some contact information just in case you want it. I'll turn it on. There you go.
So the RMF question you had. So a lot of, how many people have been through RMF? It's not fun, is it? So a lot of that is based on the processes that they require you to have. So the documentation that they required us to have is intensive. So I think part of your continuous assessment is, are you maintaining your process of documentation through a configuration management process? Are you doing the routine scannings that can be put into EMAS? So I think part of what we're really changing to do is implementing the checks or the controls to make sure that those processes stay up to date. Because that's the first thing that'll kill you. If they come in and go, well, you haven't updated this in 3 years. Your documentation's out of date. There's 2 versions of that's been put out, and you haven't done that, right? So part of that is we're having to learn, like everyone else is having to learn, on how to build in those internal processes. Because if you haven't went through RMF, it costs 4 times as much and takes 4 times as many people to do it. Everybody's got to do it. Our system admins have to do it, or B&D, or everybody's got to have a play in this. So it's not a trivial function. It's costing the Army a lot of money up front. Should save the Army money down the road, in theory.
Yeah, if we truly get to that continuous assessment piece.
That's right. But to answer your question, a lot of that is how much energy are the system owners going to put into ensuring that the process and documentation are in place. Now, what we can handle is what we give you controls for. Yeah. That would be That'd be nice to talk about.
Yeah. Because right now we're in a lot of manual processes and manual documentation things going on out there. And we went through it when we went through our RMF assessment about 6 months ago. We wrote a lot of documentation, and it was very painful for the poor essays.
Are there any other questions? Dude, I'm calling it 30 minutes. I mean 60 minutes.
We're going to round up very close enough.
We're going to round up. It's government accounting.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.